Hello, this is the Harboring Light. I'm Mary. I give a conservative take about the world around me. Feedback is immensely important. Feel free to reach out. Best way to do that is through email and YouTube. And as I mentioned, I am running ads on Paramount Plus. You have an ad about, you see an ad about the Harboring Light. That's me. And then audio, you can hear me through different platforms. And you can actually hear my voice promoting my show. Alright, so I'm on a lot of different platforms, so it won't be hard to find me. So, check that out too. Alright, so it's Friday, so I'm focusing in on all of you. So the topic of choice here is Dutch literature. Here we go.
Een eenvoudig referaat, onmogelijk aan de buitenkant. Een walm van jaren achterstand. Blijft gekeerd voor aan een rad, voor volgers van het linkerpad. De kaulas in de binnenstad.
Now, the Dutch have given us so much in as far as cultural value when it comes to paintings, food, fashion. Particularly with paintings, when you get into the breaking up with Flemish painters and during the Italian Renaissance and so forth. They really made their own as far as depicting the aspects of royalty, so forth, or the aspects of religion. And in this particular case, with Dutch Flemish life, really getting into the aspects of everyday people and then the ins and outs of living your day, doing everything from point A to point B. A really good example of that is Peter Bruegel, because before him, and then you see this even more pronounced in the aspects of different ways when you get into movies, film, you get into was just music in general. There's whole genres, that focus on this. When you get into, outside of folk music, rock, some pop music, when it goes on to this certain times and eras and so forth. Now, focusing in on literature, as I said, and I'll say it again, when it's done right and when it's under the right circumstances, literature can really open up to delve in and to talk about certain topics in a candid way. And so, with that note, let's see what's going on with Dutch literature. All right, I'll get right back to you. All right, so, of course, sources, one source will be provided for you, and the other source, where I focus in on the 20th century on next week, will also be provided on next week. I'll say, okay, so this week we're going to do a survey and open up the doors and the books, pages there onto not British, what am I talking about? Dutch literature. All right, so I had it. Alright, so let's do it this way then. Alright, bear with me here. Okay, so alright, so here we go. And this is what the survey is saying. So it says Dutch literature and language. So from the end of the 12th century onward, the Dutch language developed into a literary medium in chivalric romances and Didic poems. Good examples of this is Jacob van Martlet from 1235 to 1300, which was mystic works, and Jan van Roosebrugge from 1293 to 1381, which were plays and songs. So the dialects of the wealthy southern province of Flanders and Brabant were very prevalent in literature. So around 1600, linguistic homology shift to Holland in the north as a result of important changes in the political and cultural landscape after the Dutch revolted against the Habsburg regime. So this is very important when you get in the aspects of laying down the format for what's going to happen, in the 20th century. And then particularly the big boom or big world war to focus in on, when we get in, unfortunately, the tragedy that happened because of that is World War II. And I'll get into details about that next week. So, in the course of the 12th century, a standard language was established that was based on the dialect of Holland with Brabantic influences. So, grammar and orthography were regulated, and the active pursuit of movement fought against loan words from Latin and French. And that's very interesting with the aspects of, trying to, with your own language, make sure that you cultivate something that's just generated from your own culture instead of, borrowing from somebody else in order to express what you're saying properly. And there's a lot of respect to that. So, rhetorians. So, forgive me for the pronunciation. I'll do my best with this. So this is the Flemish. Dutch Flemish. So the Yikers, or the rhetorians, dominated public literacy life in the vernacular form from about 1450 to 1620. And then, from American point of view, from the 1620, hey, we get this with the Plymouth Rock and then landing in the New Americas. All right, so the groups originated in Flanders early in the 15th century and were inspired poetically by the French arts des second rhetoric. So the rhetorians aimed at an ornate language with a preference of the use of French loanwords, so to speak. So a tendency marked later by more pursuits and poets such as Bordeaux. So, forgive me, I'm a little hungry there. If you hear the little gurgle monster bubble there, stomach monster there, that's what's going on. So the Chambers of Rhetoric were an urban organization that, for example, that played an important role in the religious festivals, at which they offered entertainment for their fellow citizens and provided a public relations service for their towns by means of inter-urban consonants and performing and reciting. So scholars differ in their opinions about the goals of these chambers. Do they, as the Herman Pell believes, did they represent an attempt of the urban elites to impose a civic morality onto citizens, or did they give voice to common culture? Now, in addition to collections of ballads Nearly 600 of the rhetoricians played and have served, and they were mostly allegory, moralities, and biblical stories, but included historical and mythological dramas. So the plays contained a great deal of arguing on ethical and religious issues, which were intermingled with lively scenes from daily life. So in Brussels, a cycle of 7 Joys of Mary was performed from 1441 to 1559. Now, the best known plays of the rhetoricians is Die Spiegel der Schalik van Eerlijk, which was 1496, and The Mirror of Salvation of Every Man, which is that. So the source of the English in the Summary of Every Man in 1510, and the Markland of Van Newminging and 1500. So about a young, which was about a young woman, which is about a young woman seduced by the devil. And let me say that again. I'll say, hold on just a minute. Which is about a young woman seduced by the devil. All right, so the Markland and the Van Nugen is actually a prose text with the extensive insert of dialogues to be read aloud, whereas the Aklerk once won a prize of dramatic context in Bartbent, but neither can be connected with a specific chamber of rhetoric, nor did the most interesting rhetorical poet belong to a chamber. So as a woman, the Antwerp schoolmistress and Benz from 1493 to 1575 was excluded from membership. So what they're saying is women were excluded from membership, basically. So 3 collections of her ballads were printed under the protection of the local Franciscans. So Benjings wrote the pungent satirical vein against the rise entitled The Lutheranism, but also on the subject of love and marriage. So this was very prevalent in the aspects of what we get revolts and the Protestant Revolution. Protestant revolt and all the religious revolts against the tyranny that was unfortunately rearing its ugly head towards, everyday people and forcing people to, the monarchy and then the political reign, forcing people into, pretty much what you can see playing itself into now, and how this is unfortunately probably never going to be something that will remedy itself. From my point of view, it's one of those things where the best solution, I think, is to see how spiritually how you feel, right? What aligns with you, and then have a discourse with what your particular religious sect of how they feel, and come together and be together and try, the things that you don't agree with, work those out. But that's easier said than done, because naturally, unfortunately, that doesn't work that way, because that's what goes along when we get into, which I think would help a lot too. Some people get that aspects of religion, but some people don't. But just like with how you feel with politics, or how you feel with certain aspects of culture and music, there are people who can be very dogmatic and pragmatic, extremely pragmatic in the way that they view stuff. And this was, unfortunately, the times in which it was very prevalent in showing its ugly head in this era, particularly when you're in the Dutch culture. And so having commentary speaking out against it, and then, also in the aspects of making a place for yourself, which is a narrative that is pushed a lot now, that says, oh, well, but this case in point with this lady here, making sure she can speak what she wants to say, and really be very poignant in her expression about religion and how it's placed in their culture, in her culture at the time. She went away from herself, and where she knew she would be let in. And see, this is what's really important to look at, when we go on into history, and then we go on and we look into our cultural land map as of today. Now, you see, there's a lot of people that, it's more, which is unfortunate, because that old adage where, the loudest wheelbarrow, or the loudest, I'm trying to think. Y'all know what I'm talking about. The, what the heck? It's not coming, the word's not coming into my mind. But anyway, you get my point. And you pay attention to it the most because there's nothing in it, and it makes so much noise. But it's only, and so many selective people that think like that, right? But they force other people to say, oh, well, hey, and then they use media for their propaganda to say, hey, this is the way the life is, don't you want it better? But they don't actually want that. But my point is here is if you're determined to express yourself and make change, there is a way. And here's another historical example of that, of a woman, being very adamant about what she wants to do and where she wants to go, and finding the resources to do so. And then the aspects of how women are looked, it's ridiculous to say that, and it's ridiculous to say that now, that there's not hardship for the female sect, or there's not hardship for the being a female, or being naturally born a female. I mean, come on. But I don't know. It's just one of those things. And this saying also goes a long way. Life is really what you make it. A lot of times that's what it boils down to. All right, so given their interest in religious disputes, the Chambers got into trouble when the Reformation gained a foothold in the Netherlands. So during the repression of the Protestant movements, several Rhetorians were executed on the charges of expressing, being heretics here with their ideas, and most of the Chambers' activities were forbidden by the Catholic authorities in 1560. But from about 1580, most towns in the province of Holland, having liberated themselves from Habsburg rule, allowed the Chambers to perform again, putting aside the objections of the Calvinist aspects against their theatrical performances. So in Catholic Flanders and Brabant, the Chambers flourished anew from 1609. So long-standing traditions and the conformity that was intricate, I'm not saying that right. That was pretty much what they're saying. That was infused in a collective production of literature. This delayed the acceptance of the new Renaissance modes and granted the Chambers a long life among the lower middle class. So, the Dutch, excuse me. So the Dutch revolt, which broke out in, excuse me, I'll be right back. Alright, so sorry about that. Got a bit of a frog in my throat here. Alright, so let's wrap up and move on here. It says the Dutch Revolt, which broke out in 1568 and resulted in a 85-year war against Spain, was accompanied by a large production of songs of protest and propaganda and others that gave accounts of military actions. So the martyr songs, touching reports of the steps of the Anabaptist martyrs at the stake, are a special category of this example. So Calvinist polemics are formed at their extreme, as another example, which were written in an exuberant rebellionist style, and are directed at a bit sarcasm of all the aspects of Roman Catholicism, of Roman Catholic. So other examples that humanist Rick O'Corin, and who earned the reputation of the apostles of the tolerance, can be seen as a Marxian sort of concept. So his main works, the Kunst des Wohlstandskunst, are the ethics, that is, the art of living well, are aimed at training how to use your willpower as a human. And okay, so, and then we get on to Amsterdam in the aspects of dramatics coming out of that. So from about 1560, the elements of international Renaissance literature were introduced in Dutch literature. So sonnets and odes gradually replaced the ballads of the Rudin of the rhetorics, and the morality of plays slowly gave to tragedies and comedies. So the patriarch and the poets of the place day became models of the lyric poets, and the aspects of the sonnets, and later with the Aristotle. And they were exerted as an influence on drama. So freed from the relatively anonymity of the veterans, individual authors came to the forefront. So the golden age of Dutch literature began in 1580, some decades before the birth of the painters such as Rembrandt, Steen, and Vermeer, whose works represent the golden age of Dutch art as well. So an earlier supporter of the new Renaissance ideas was Jan van der Noort from Antwerp, who adapted the style of the themes of the Pierre Ronsard for works in his mother tongue. So a Calvinist refugee from Van der Noort published hit theater, a collage of translations in his own prose and poetry in London, so in 1568 to be exact, which followed a French and then an English translation of it. So after the surrender of Antwerp to the Spain army in 1585, a massive immigration. No, I'm not saying that. Yes. I'm saying it right. So a massive immigration of highly qualified Protestants took place. So many of them settled in Amsterdam, which took over Antwerp's role in book production. One of the specialties of the time was beautifully illustrated, illustrated emblems of books. And this very popular genre the image and the text together express a deeper meaning in the form. So the motto and the exclamation is in that form. So, all right. So we'll go on. Let's see. So let's see. All right. So we're gonna go classism. Yes. I'm going to end on this. So, classism. So, in 1667, a group of Amsterdamist intellectuals with the Spensults Lord Rick Meyer as one of their spokesmen, founded a literary society under the name of Neil Bolton Bus. And their Amsterdam was to raise the level of Dutch poetry, particularly in drama, by confronting it in the international standards which they found in French classicism. All right, so for something new and fresh, turn to prose. So an interesting example of this is the Hendrik Smear's aspects of work. So it was about an imagery content where people discuss a religious tolerance, and for more of an example of that. All right, so let me go on. Okay, so novels. A lot of prose, for instance, was extremely. What was? Let me rephrase this. What was really popular, as far as novels, which makes a whole lot of sense, is travel novels, because this will. But it really is true. When I was a kid, it was the aspects that when you read can take you to far off lands, and here's a good example of that, of where that comes from, of how that's really true. And then, when you get into certain genres of books, yeah, it can take you to different far off lands. However, almost no original novels were written, although many foreign novels were read in Dutch translation. So a minor but curious exception is the group of 10 libertine novels from the last quarter of the century that occupied a special place in the international history and of the sultry kind, if y'all get what I'm saying. All right, so several were translated into French, German, or English, and the Dutch title is more explicit about the philosophy of the book, which focuses on plain truth and fighting hypocrisy. So recently, these novels have been associated with the early radical enlightenment of the Dutch Republic. So they may be regarded as well as a reaction against the purity of the pursuit of so being virtuous of the classic movement of those years. All right, so why did I bring this up here? And I'm going to end on this. All right, so I think that this really pulls it all in, and it's a really good example. Now, I mentioned before, and I'll mention it again. Now, Quentin Tarantino, he directed and he wrote the book Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Now, the stuntman for Rick Dalton, I think that was the character name. All right. He was a piece of, you know what, it was really adamant who he was and what he was in the book. Okay? So he goes on into this sort of soliloquy, I guess you can say, or and maybe more, the best way to describe it is anterior dialogue a lot of times, when he's giving his thoughts about the landscape of cinema and that era when you cross into the late 60s going on to the 70s, right? He had this attitude that, American cinema is not as forthcoming when you get into being more centrally free with everything, right? And he kept talking about how, foreign films really go there as far as, being more hedonistic, Now, this is really pulling into the aspects of where do we go when it comes to moral ground, right? Now, as I said, as I was reading earlier about the aspects of what was going on in the cultural landscape of Dutch culture, it was a lot of, even in this time in the 15th, 16th century, about the aspects of where does religion place myself? How do I place myself in religion? Where do I stand? And then moving on towards modernity, right? And so the aspects of what I just said with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and moving towards now, it's really interesting how things make a circular pattern in the aspects of, hey, let's push something towards the edge a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, and to seeping in about where do we go as far as concepts and decency. And literature really gets into covering these things in ways that is quite different and unique, because you imagine these things. And, some people will say, like, your imagination is far greater than what you can visually see. And that is what is so immensely explosive about literature, because, when you read things and when you hear things, and then the sort of the sort of celebrity behind it, it says a lot. And it says a lot about the cultural landscape and cultural commentary of the time then versus now, too, as well. And so that's, part of the reason why I focus on literature now in this category when we get on to, talking and addressing on Fridays with all my fans. Well, no, not fans, I'm sorry. With all my listeners here. Because I don't know. This whole thing, I don't see y'all as like that. Because I see y'all as people who, you want to hear something different and new. And, and just your listeners. And, whether you are, doing your day-to-day or what have you, I appreciate it. And so I think that talking about certain literature and then getting feedback of what y'all think about the aspect of how you feel about literature or so forth from a cultural standpoint is really important, because it gets that conversation going, and it pushes things further ahead, I think, into understanding the world around us here. And so that is the main point, too, that should be understood. All right, so with that said, I know that was a lot to say. This reaches the end, and I really appreciate all of you. And as I said in the beginning, feel free to reach out to me. either through email or YouTube. Alright, so this just reaches the end of the harboring light. Tune in, turn up, and absolutely take care. Bye-bye for now.